and introduce everyone. So, hello, folks. I'm coming here from the Mid-Yale Hall. My name is Hannah Eynon, and I'm a representative for Yale. And this evening we've got Ash-Lynn Tavener from Peatland Action, who's going to give us a super presentation. I've worked with Ash before on a project, and oh, sorry, here we go. I can hear that. It really, I learned an immense amount about peatlands that I didn't really know in a short space of time. And that will lead us in to the report, the Shetland, from Rory Gillies with the Shetland Flyer. And I very much appreciate you both joining us here today and being able to do this. There's been a lot of effort put in, and it's great to have a voice. Often, sometimes with a document that can be 2D, but this very much allows things to become much more than that. So without much further ado, I'll hand this over to Ash, and also huge thanks to Anna as well for all your support and getting this off the ground. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. Some of you are going to have heard a lot of this stuff I'm about to say before, so apologies. But I'll go for it for those of you who maybe haven't. I'm just going to share my screen, so if you could just let me know if that's working, because I've not used Mac before. So, can you all see that? Great. Okay, so I'm going to quickly run through a bit about peatland restoration in like a Shetland context, and then I'll try and leave a tiny bit of time afterwards in case there's any questions. So I'm a Peatland Action Officer, which is a Nature Scot group set up by the government. When we're talking about peatland restoration, we're talking about carbon capture. So often what people think of when they think of carbon capture is trees and planting trees, but actually peatlands are far better at capturing carbon. So trees and forests cover about 30% of the world's surface, whereas peatlands only cover 3% of the world's surface. And yet the peatlands store more than twice the amount as the trees do. So it gives you an idea of just the sheer quantity of carbon being captured. And that's all because of this wonderful plant here called sphagnum moss. And the thing that's great about this plant is that it's able to store a lot of water, so it can hold about 30 times its own weight in water, and it can survive long periods of desiccation as well. So if you have drier periods, say like May time in Shetland can get very dry, this plant can actually hold a lot of water on the bog, keeping it wet. And the reason we want to keep it wet is that when a bog is in a wet condition, the bacteria can't get in to break down the plant matter, and that's why it's storing that carbon, because if it was to break down, the carbon would be released into the atmosphere, but because it's so wet, it can't break down. It just gets pushed under succeeding layers of moss, and it builds up and becomes peat. So the government have committed £250 million towards peatland restoration by 2030, and that's because peatland restoration is by far and away one of the most cost-effective ways that you can save carbon emissions. And their target is to restore 250,000 hectares. So far, we're not quite building up to that. So I think this year we restored about 10,000 hectares, which is great, but we want to be really increasing pace and scale of delivery to be able to hit that target. So yeah, in Shetland, about 50% of Shetland is blanket bog, so it's a really important place for this kind of work, and it's a really great opportunity for Shetland to make a difference to climate change. But about 80% of that habitat is in a degraded condition. You can see from the picture behind all those kind of cracks and scars in the landscape, that's all degradation of the peatland. And that can happen for a variety of reasons. It can happen through overgrazing, or it could be cutting for peat banks to burn. It could be burning, although not so much in Shetland, or just any other kind of anthropogenic cause. But then also in Shetland and elsewhere, you have the problem of the weather. So as soon as there is a small scar in the landscape, the wind, the rain gets in, and it kind of exacerbates that problem. So when we're talking about peatlands in a healthy condition, they look a little bit like this. So they're very wet. There's a lot of moss, a lot of cotton grasses, a lot of pools. They're really great for wildlife. They're sucking in carbon from the atmosphere. They're supporting biodiversity, water quality. So they're actually saving water companies money because they're cleaning the water as the water funnels through them. They're an important historical kind of source because you can find a lot of very interesting finds in peat if you go down through the layers. And yeah, good for recreational use. Whereas a peatland in bad condition often looks like this, which is what a lot of Shetland does look like. So this will be a net carbon source. So instead of actually taking in that carbon from the atmosphere and locking it in, it's actually releasing carbon at a very fast rate. So for every 1 hectare of degraded peatland like this, it's estimated that it might be releasing around 17 tons of carbon per year. So yeah, you have all the problems that come with that as well. So this is the map that Rory will go through in much more detail, showing peatlands in Yell. And I think the figure that we came out with was 67 kilotons of carbon equivalent per year, which is a huge amount of carbon coming off the land in Yell, and by far and away the biggest source of carbon release in Yell. When you compare it to things like transport and heating houses, it's a huge amount. So it's really what we should be focusing on. But I'll let Rory explain that more during his talk. Yeah, this is just showing some of the uses in the past and the present for peatlands. So you have, archaeological finds, you have people digging up peats for the fire. I should say that we don't, Peatland Action, we don't ask people not to dig peats. We understand it's a really important cultural activity, and for some people it's their only way of connecting to the landscape as well. Ideally, we'd live in a country where people didn't have to go dig up dirt to heat their homes. We'd like to think that in the 21st century, people would have better heating schemes, but there you go. People use it for their grazing. It's obviously great habitat for wildlife and a carbon sink. But then thinking about the future of peatlands, especially on Yell, you've got things like wind farm developments coming along. I'm not going to come out for or against wind farms. They are just what they are. It's a very important thing, I think, to be transitioning away from fossil fuel use into clean energy. But part of installing wind farms is that you do have to dig up a lot of peats, which isn't ideal. I do also understand, though, that peatlands are good areas for wind farms because they're very exposed, they're very windy, so it's not clear-cut, essentially. The wind farms do have to do a little bit of peatland restoration as part of their planning permission, so in an ideal world, they'll be doing a lot of that, and they'd be doing it well to make up for the damage that they've done. This is just a picture from a site that I took I went to in Aberdeen called Glendye, and this is the top of an exposed hill, and you can see there the landscape is just eroded right down to the mineral, so through a good few meters of peat, so that's a few thousand years of peat accumulation, because it takes peat a year to accumulate a millimeter of peat. So for every meter of peat you go down, you're going down 1,000 years into history, essentially. And what was kind of sad about this site is that when you went on top of one of those mushroom hags, it was full of life. You know, there was this incredible biodiversity. There were berries, there were lizards, there were spiders, frogs. It was beautiful. It was like a lovely living like habitat, and yet, you know, just a couple of meters away, it's completely dead. And that's essentially what will happen in Shetland eventually, is our peatlands will just get washed away, so we'll lose that natural heritage if we don't work to restore them. And yeah, I've saved the best for last money. So this is really the big hold up in peatland restoration right now, is that we don't have enough money to do the work that we need to do. So obviously the government have committed that big amount of money, but that's not going to be anywhere near the amount that we need to do the work that we need to do. So we do need to be pulling in as much private investment as we can into the industry, which obviously brings with it a whole load of complications, a lot of fears of, you know, greenwashing and things like that. But yeah, it's something that unfortunately does just need to happen. It just needs to be done in a responsible way, so that people know that they're getting something good for their money. So there's something called the Peatland Code, and that's been set up by the IUCN, which is the International Union Conservation of Nature, and that's a kind of accreditation scheme for peatland carbon credits. So essentially, for every bit of restoration a landowner does, they can earn these carbon credits, which they can then sell on the market to whoever they like. Essentially, they could sell it to another business owner, or they could sell it to a big company, or they could sell it to the government, whoever they want to sell it to, really. It's a pretty open market. So yeah, we need to kind of get that investment coming in as much as possible in order to get this work happening. And in Shetland as well, we really need to build a workforce, because at the moment we're really limited in the amount of operators we actually have to do the work that needs to be done as well. Even if we do manage to get money through for projects, we often don't have enough skilled operators, excavation operators, to do the work. So I was actually at the science fair today in Lowick, and we were showing the kids from the local high schools a excavator simulator to try and get them interested in the industry. So hopefully we've got a few young ones interested, but you know, the work needs to be there for them to get into as well. And with the way Peatland Action are going, they're starting to score their projects based on things like size, complexity, value for money, and unfortunately Shetland comes in quite poorly on all of those metrics, which is why this year we didn't get any projects funded, and next year it's likely to be the same. They're thinking to potentially have a ring-fence pot of money for islands and crofters in the future, so that people aren't getting left out or left behind. But at the moment, certainly they're focusing on the easy wins, which are all in the Highlands. You know, you have these big estates where it's just one landowner involved, and it's very relatively easy to go in and do a lot of work and get a lot of hectares restored. Whereas in Shetland, we have lots of little patches of crofts, and it's often not clear who the landowner is, and that makes it really difficult in terms of cost effectiveness and scale of delivery, which is why that's why it's difficult to pull in that Peatland Action funding right now. But hopefully that will change. We'll just have to roll with the punches and maybe try and pull in our own funding, potentially from the wind farms. So if anyone has any ideas about that, please do let me know. Okay, I think that's me. Does anyone have any questions?
I have one. Thanks, Ash-Lynn. I'd like to ask, when your peatland is restored, how is, I understand, you know, the opportunities for drone review to quantify the extent and the quality of the peat, but to measure its health at a ground level, what instrumentation is used so that you can actually quantify that?
So we usually go out and do a peat depth and condition survey when we're first thinking about a site for restoration work. So what that involves is laying out a 100-metre by 100-metre grid across the landscape. And then I literally, or whoever it is that's surveying, goes out with a tablet with that map and the 100-metre grid. And at every point, we take a peat depth measurement, and we categorise the peatlands into one of 4 categories. So it'll either be actively eroding, which is the kind of worst one. That's the one where you're releasing kind of 17 tonnes of carbon equivalent per hectare per year. or it could be it could be drained, which is where it's not necessarily eroding, but the water is coming off the lands, either through artificial drains or potentially natural drains. And then the next category would be modified. So modified is where it's not really natural. Perhaps there's still a lot of grazing. The plant communities aren't exactly what they should be. There might be a bit of enrichment going on, something like that. And then the next category is near natural. We don't actually categorize any peatland as being kind of pristine, because that just doesn't really exist. You can only get to near natural as the best category. And that's where you have, like I said before, a lot of pools, a lot of sphagnum mosses, a lot of bog cotton as well. And you can kind of, by looking at the different communities of mosses, you can gauge how good a condition that habitat's in.
Thank you.
Yes, I had a question. Obviously restoration is a very long-term process. In terms of sort of seeing immediate results, by immediate I'm meaning in the next sort of decade or 2 decades, when do you expect to start to see the sort of big returns?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's all to do with that finance, leveraging in that finance. So what I would love to see would be a group set up in Shetland, like a Shetland Peatland partnership. We do have a kind of partnership at the moment made up of various people like Scottish Water and the council and RSPB, but that's mainly just to discuss issues around peatland restoration. It's not to actually deliver the work. I would love to see a group which actually delivers this work. So you have already partnerships like the Flow Country Partnership and the Southwest Peatland Partnership, and they actually have in-house project officers, contractors, people that look at the archaeology of sites, and they do that all themselves, and they're delivering at quite good scales, and they're doing really good work because they're able to do that follow-on monitoring as well to see what's worked and what hasn't worked, and they're able to be quite specific to their location because different places are going to be very different in terms of what works. So I would love to see something like that set up, but it's money, like everything, we have to have quite a big initial funding for that sort of thing to work.
And then sort of following on the funding, there's a lot of sort of private sector activity now in restoration, because again, it's dipping into a pot of government money that's there. Are you guys working with the private sector? It's quite a few companies that we've done work for. So,
okay, what sort of companies do you mean?
Well, the likes of Forest Carbon, stuff like that, and then they're doing their they're basically factoring carbon projects, carbon offset, yeah.
So we don't have a lot of kind of agents and companies like that in Shetland, and I don't know if that's just because of the complexity of the sites that we have here, and like I said, you have the issues around the Croft law, which doesn't help. It's probably they probably can get much easier wins elsewhere in Scotland, sorry. It would be great to get more kind of agents coming up here and working and developing projects, because at the moment it's just me and Sue trying to do it all. But yeah, there's just a lot of complications, I think, which don't make it as attractive an option as elsewhere potentially.
Cheers, thank you.
Ewan?
Just a quick question, because I've been involved in some conversations whereby it's sort of coming down to what active peat is, standing water, etc. But we've got a situation here on Barra whereby if you've got natural regeneration of trees occurring because the grazing pressure has been eased, what's the situation in terms of peatland restoration there? Because there's a sort of argument the trees will occur in suitable habitat and not necessarily in waterlogged habitat. Would you advise leaving them? Or I've seen other projects where sort of conifer plantations have been removed and with a view to re-establishing peatland.
Yeah, I mean, certainly would advise against any conifer plantation, and yeah, we do a lot of forest to bog work in Peatland Action, trying to restore that peatland to its condition. Essentially, where peatland's really degraded, and like I said earlier, it's become modified. The plant communities aren't what they were. It can become dry enough for trees to start establishing, and it's really a judgment call then at that stage as to whether you want to put the effort into removing those trees and trying to re-wet the land to essentially bring it back to that peatland habitat, or whether it's not worth the effort. So if I had a huge site that was all peatland, and then maybe on the very fringe it was starting to dry out and there was starting to be some tree regeneration on some very shallow peat, I might just say, do you know what, it's not worth the amount of effort it's going to take to keep those trees at bay. But if you had a very deep peat resource, for example, like a few meters of peat, and then you had trees starting to regenerate, I would definitely be looking to remove those, because yeah, the deeper the peat, the more carbon stock you've got there. And as soon as you get trees, the roots are drying out the soil essentially, which is why there's more of a carbon release than the carbon store that you'd get from the tree.
No, thanks. It's because it's different. It looks, your topography up in Yale looks a lot flatter than we've got. So we've got peat accumulation more in the valleys with gradients that are more freely drained. So it's an interesting one.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think, in valleys where you've got very shallow peat and the habitat's already changed, then I wouldn't necessarily be too worried about it reverting to a riparian kind of tree habitat. I would be more worried if it was on deeper peat or if it was on good blanket bog. But like you said, if it's wet enough, the tree shouldn't establish anyway, in theory.
Thanks.
Is that someone on Hannah's Eynon's got their hand up?
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Adrian Brockles here. I'll do a good impression of Hannah, I'm sure. But yeah. So my question is, given that you say blanket bog holds more carbon than all of the world's forests, why is the imperative not to restore all degraded peatland rather than industrialising some of the damaged bits with renewables, which are finite anyway, and involve disruption of bog hydrology? And I'm thinking particularly of the Energy Isles development, which is actually largely pristine. And obviously, as soon as you start messing about with that, you will alter the bog hydrology, which will degrade it. So, I mean, there's kind of two questions there. The first is, why are we not doing something like the Bond Challenge, which in relation to the rainforests, which suggests that, you build a renewable development and actually then put some effort into restoring areas of rainforest. Why is that not being done with peat without industrialising any of the peatland, as it were, given that it's even more valuable as a carbon sink than rainforest?
Yeah, I mean, you may be asking the wrong person. I don't have any control over where wind farm developments go, certainly. I mean, I wouldn't personally put a wind farm development on a near natural area of bog, which is where it is going. But unfortunately, they've got their planning permission now, so there's really not much I feel that we could do at this stage to stop it from happening.
I guess that's true.
The best thing we can do is probably work with them to make sure that the work that they do is done in a responsible manner, and that the restoration work they do as part of the planning permission is done to a high quality.
But I mean, I suppose in general terms, my question is more, why is there not a campaign to have this stopped as a sort of general rule, by citing what's already being done with rainforest and saying, well, look, peatland is more valuable than rainforest in terms of being a carbon capture or a carbon sequester, if you like. So surely we should be according it the same, if not even greater protection.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally understand where you're coming from. That would be a very sensible approach. I guess the government are very focused on transitioning to net zero, which they should be. And probably peatland sites are logical sites from their perspective, because they are hilly and they do have a lot of wind. So I suppose that's the thinking that's gone behind it. But as I say, that's not me that's had any control over that.
But where does Shetland Amenity Trust stand, perhaps? I mean, in terms of how it sits with this, because they haven't really said too much apart from objecting to the Energy Isles thing originally.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't around when that planning permission was going through, because I've only been in the post for a year, so I don't know what their objection would have been, but I'm guessing it would have been on the basis of it being a near natural area.
Finally, do you believe Statkraft's claim that the development will pay back all its carbon in 2.5 years?
I mean, if that's the sums that they've come out with, then you need to kind of go to the source of where they're getting those calculations. So I think it might be the James Hutton Institute which have developed that calculation for the government. but I'm certainly no good at maths personally, so I wouldn't be able to double check that and make sure it was correct. I wouldn't be surprised if it was able to offset the carbon emissions to an extent, because these wind farms are supposed to generate, you know, a lot of power. But like I said, you'd need to actually look at the calculations that they're using and decide for yourself if those are valid.
Yeah. I mean, as far as I understand it, those calculations exclude residual and embodied carbon, which...
What do you mean, sorry?
So residual carbon is that which is left, which is kind of left over after all other measures have been made to kind of reduce it. So, you know, an embodied carbon is, for example, the manufacture of the blades, the transport, all of that. Now that's not something that's included in the net zero accounting either.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, maybe
and so it's very easy to get the answer that you want, provided you define your parameters before you start.
Yeah, I mean, if I was you, I'd go to the source of that and maybe ask James Hutton Institute what they've based that on.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question, if I may. Are you aware of any protection or assurances that have been made with the wind farm regarding fire? Because they are known to be, I've just finished doing the community risk management planning framework for the UK Fire and Rescue Service, and it's definitely not unheard of for wind farms. I'm also working on EU fire log in the area of wildfire damage and management, and it's definitely not unheard of for a wind farm to be the cause of wildfires, and that could have devastating effects on the peat. So is there any known management issues around that have been instituted?
Not that I know of, but I mean, I don't work for a wind farm. I work for Peatland Action, which is very separate. You know, we don't deal with developments at all. We deal with public funding for projects.
But if there is wildfire, have you a peatland management strategy for that in conjunction with Scottish Fire, or?
Not that I know of. No, there's not.
Scotland. I'm sorry.
I mean, in theory, you know, peatlands should be wet enough that they shouldn't catch fire, and if anything, they should actually stop wildfires from happening, because when a wildfire reaches the peatland, it's been shown in mainland Scotland it will stop. But yeah, certainly where we have drier, more degraded area of peatlands, there will be an increased risk of fire in the future. Yes. And yeah, it's a really valid point. You know, we should maybe be thinking about actual action plans or what we would do if that happens.
I know in the Falklands they've just completed training down in the Falklands, because that's UK's largest overseas territory peat deposits, and the problem there is on certain types of peat, the fire burns deeper and longer, and so it's getting the local communities aware and able to respond at an early stage that's been critical. So I was just curious if there's anything similar been done in Yarra.
No, I think up to now, you know, it's always been thought that Shetland's so wet that it couldn't possibly catch fire anyway. But yeah, certainly in the future it will get drier, and we already see periods in May where it's very dry and we don't get any rain. And there was a few fires this year, although it was on the heather, and I think it was more to do with the new grouse licensing that's coming in Scotland. So essentially they'll have to get licenses to burn them all in future. So I think a few crofters thought they'll go and do a last minute burn, because unfortunately there's this conception that by burning them all you're improving grazing. So there were a few fires this year because of that, but luckily it didn't go down into the peat layer as far as I'm aware. It just burnt off the top layer of heather. But yeah, no, it's a really good point, and it's something I'll discuss with the partnership, is should we be putting together some sort of response for if there is a fire on Peat.
Yeah, if you, I mean, I'm a sort of a conduit of information, so if I can help, just
Yeah, thank you.
ping me a message. I'm one of the few people who's actually been up to Shetland and been right up to Eust, so I am familiar with the territory.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, thank you. Okay, is that everything for everyone? To hand over to, is it Rory next?
Yeah, thanks. Oh, on you go, Han. Thanks ever so much, Ash. That was really interesting and really good questions too. Do you want to go ahead, Rory, and I'll let you introduce yourself as the Mr. Shetland Flyer.
Sorry, just trying to find how to unmute my microphone, but I've done that. I've been on. I was on training all day today, and I've been not sitting in front of this camera all day, and I had about an hour's break, and then I'm back here again. So if I'm flagging a wee bit, just give me a kick, and I'll get things moving. Thank you very much for inviting me along tonight. My name is Rory Gillies. I run a company called Shetland Flyer Aerial Media. We're essentially a drone company. Most of the stuff we do is surveys, mapping. We've been involved with monitoring and basically peatland restoration since 2016. We were working down at a site down in Cuddingsborough, and we started developing ways to use multispectral imagery, which I'll go into in a wee minute, with drones to classify condition. Basically, when we were speaking to Ewan earlier on, he was talking about being on the ground with wellies. What we've been trying to develop over the last, well, actually I was working with it slightly before that, but that's when we actually took it into kind of more into a commercial sense. But back in 2014, I was working on ways to basically look at geomorphology from the drone, and then so that went nicely on to maybe being able to use the Peatland Code assessment units to be able to use aerial imagery to look at and to work out where the hags and the gullies that are, without actually having to either sit and draw them manually on a Google Earth or to get your boots on and go out there onto the site. So we've been developing different ways of doing Peatland Code assessment units, and I think we're now at a fairly high level of confidence. The last time we looked at it statistically, we're at about a 90% level of confidence that we're picking up all the geomorphological features, easy for me to say, on the ground. So we can identify gullies. We can even actually tweak our algorithm so we can identify gullies at a certain depth, and we can ignore other ones. We use hydrology algorithms to look at the water courses, water flows over the restoration sites. It's also very useful to slightly have a larger area where we're getting the actual water flow into or out of the restoration site. So I've built up, well, we have, the two or three of us have been working on this, a fair amount of experience. I am by no means an expert on the ecology of it. Ash is your person for that. I know basically the Peatland Code. I know GIS, which is Geographical Information Systems. I'm actually a geologist by trade from many, many years ago, but I sort of, a lot of this stuff I learned through that. I've been able to apply to the work I'm doing now. But I do understand GIS. I do understand how we can classify things. And we've been working with drone imagery. Now, when I was, Alice spoke to me a year or so back, probably more than that now, about doing some drone surveys on the peatland in Yell for the Carbon Neutral Island project, and sounded like a great idea. But then looking at the 200 odd square kilometers of Yell, it would take an awful lot of time to fly that with a drone. So we looked at different methods of doing it, and what we decided was the best course of action after doing some tests was to use satellite imagery, and basically applying the techniques we use to classify the the ground type from our drone imagery, we were taking that and using the same techniques that we to the satellite imagery. And we looked at various, there's a lot of satellites producing data that are useful. Landsat for one, but we picked Sentinel, because it's a European satellite, which is also, it helps accessing the data. And the other thing was that there was the band sets, and I'll show you what the band sets are in a wee minute or two when I share my screen. So the band sets were kind of aligned with what we can use with the drone. And when we did a test on a couple of small areas, and the resolution, that's a very important one. The Sentinel satellite imagery is 10 meters. So that's basically a one pixel represents 10 meters. Now, in the great cosmic scheme of things, you think that's really low resolution. It's actually for satellite imagery, that's quite high resolution. And again, when I share the screen in a wee minute or two, you'll see what it looks like in true color, and then I'll show you the various bands and then how we classify it. From the classification perspective, we reckon we got it right. There's some difficulties. I'll run through the report quickly as well. I'm conscious of the time, but I'll run through the report quickly, the highlights of the report. And one of the problems that we had was that the spectral signature, that's when we're classifying the land cover type, basically different vegetation, different objects on the ground, water, rock, everything that is on the ground has a different spectral signature. So for instance, like a tarmac road will have a spectral signature, and that pretty much, you'll see that runs all the way up through Yale. You can very, very clearly see the road. Basically healthy peat, because of the vegetation that's on there, it has a different spectral signature to maybe heather dominated peat, which doesn't have the grasses and things we would expect to see in the sphagnum moss, all that kind of stuff. And also the heavily degraded peat, or the actively eroding peat, tends to have a large amount of bare peat. So that's stripped of all vegetation. And that picks up very well on the spectral signature. And then we can apply that. So what we do is we create training areas. These little training areas are quite small. They're maybe, obviously we've got a 10-meter resolution. So we would create training areas maybe 10 pixels by 10 pixels. So that's a 100-meter square training areas of all the representative types of land that we're interested in. And then we run that through a maximum likelihood classification. And basically what that does, it looks at all the different, the area that we're actually interested in, or the AOI, the area of interest, and it compares those spectral signatures with all the pixels, the millions of pixels on the actual imagery, and produces a classification. And again, I'll show you that all in a minute. But getting back to what I was saying, one of the problems we had was most of the coastal areas around Yale, there isn't very much peat at all. It's mostly improved grasslands. It's been, turned over for farming, for grazing, crop production, that kind of thing. But that has a very, very similar spectral signature to like some of the healthy peat, or just some of the peatland vegetation, especially some of the grasses that are growing in the peat. So that was one of the, so short of actually going and putting posts in, like as Ash was saying, was measuring the peat depth and all the rest of it. We basically used some maps from 1988, which was the last sort of major peat survey that was done, the land cover map, which has some really good data, but obviously it's changed a lot in the intervening 30 odd years. And we basically created a boundary. And so everything inside that boundary could be attributed to peatland, and everything outside the boundary could be attributed to non-peatland. And basically, when you look at all the emission factors, and I think Ash came up with the 67 kilotons, which is a huge amount of carbon. an awful lot of that is coming from these improved grasslands, which are basically carbon emitters. Just and you can't restore them. There's nothing left to restore. But within inside that peak boundary, then most of that, apart from the stuff that is agricultural, could be restored. So that's where it was one of the questions that was asked 2 or 3 times when the report initially came out, and I released a second version of the report, version 1.1, which kind of explained that a little bit better, what that boundary was about. But I'm just going to share this screen now. How do I do that? Here we go. Application windows. Screens. Oh, right, guys, I'm going to have to quit and come back because I can't share my screen without. I just had to reinstall, so I'll be back in 2 seconds.
When he's back, you might need to make him co-host. So that might be the problem.
He is already co-host, so hopefully that should work. I'll double check. Thanks for Gretchen. It's a good point. Is that looking better, Rory?
You're on mute, Rory.
Okay, can you see that screen okay? Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, excellent. Okay. I was doing something like this a couple of weeks back, and I was talking away with the screen shared, and nobody could see what I'd shared, so I thought I'd better check. There's an application called QGIS. It's basically a GIS application. It allows us to, it's phenomenally powerful. I use this for nearly 90% of the GIS work that I actually do. All the classification was done inside this application, except this is on a Mac. I work on a Mac, but the actual classification was done on a Windows machine because the classifier doesn't work properly on a Mac. But otherwise, it's pretty much identical. So what we're looking at here, I said I would show you these what the satellite imagery looks like, and so basically here we've got the Sentinel bands that I used. Well, I didn't actually use this one. It was this one. It was the first one I used. This is the green band. I don't know if you can see that. You might, if I zoom in a little bit, you'll see it's very, very faint. You'll see the road running around there. If you go down to mid-yell, you'll see a bit of the buildings there. See that okay? And then the next one is the red, which is, you can see the difference in what's being reflected back. So instead of the camera picking up RGB, which is red, green, blue, which produces white light, this is just looking at, in this situation, this one is looking at the green, only the green channel, and this one's looking only at the red channel. Now these are pretty dim, but when we get into the near infrared, now when near infrared is infrared light that we can't really see. So like heat is infrared, but we can't see infrared visually. Now this is the first band of near infrared. There's 2 near infrared bands on the Sentinel. There's actually more than that. And again, these are still at 10-meter resolution, so they're very, very high resolution. So if you zoom in, you can actually see you guys are in the Mid-Yale Hall at the moment, so I'm trying to remember where that is, but you'll be there somewhere. And that's looking at it in near infrared, and then there's another near infrared band, a slightly longer wavelength. And notice now we've gone from 10-meter resolution to 20-meter resolution. And that's what I mean about the resolution. So if you're looking at this is 10-meter resolution, so it's quite clear. You can see, you see the roads, all the rest of it. Once we go to the 20-meter resolution, everything starts to get a little bit more fuzzy until you zoom out a wee bit. But what it is picking up is it's a lot of the vegetation, particularly compare it's picking up areas that aren't being picked up by the other bands. And then we go on to this is shortwave infrared, and you'll see quite a drastic difference there between the near infrared and the shortwave infrared. Yeah, and you see the roads have all gone now. There's really tiny little bit of the road there, but what you can see is the water courses really clearly. This is all starting to pick up clearly, and this is even shorter wave infrared here. So what we do is we create little training areas on the like, so if I take off that altogether. Now this is actually this is a Sentinel. This is the true color Sentinel. So it's a little bit like what you would see when you first open Google Earth or whatever. And this is one of these rare days. This was on the 9th of July 2023. One of these rare days where there was no clouds. Although if you actually go back and look at the one of these, I think it shows it quite clearly. Maybe not on this one. See if I can find it. You can see they're not showing up here. It's too dark, but there is some wispy high cloud there. But yeah, so this is again 10-meter resolution. So if we zoom into Mid-Yale there, you can see the roads quite clearly. You can actually see the buildings quite clearly. You can see the red roof of the school there. See the health centre down there, the pier quite clearly. So in terms of detail, this is really quite high resolution. So it is great for our purposes. Now, once we pop it into the classifier, I've created all these training areas. So we had, if we look at basically the training areas we were looking at, there's obviously unclassified stuff we never classified, but commercial, industrial, and marine areas, urban and buildings, actively eroding bare peat, which was what we were saying about there's a lot of bare peat there. We looked at roads, sand and beaches, extensive grassland, loose rock, gravel and concrete, rock and stone. All these things are important to build up the actual classification, so we get the area of all the different things we've classified matches in with the area inside the red boundary. Then we've got water. There's a lot of lochs, unintensive grassland, eroded modified bog, and eroded modified bog drained and undrained. Modified bog, undrained, rock and stone, all that kind of thing. So that's what we kind of classified. Now, when it comes out the classifier, it's pretty messy looking. This is kind of what it looks like. So you can't really make a great deal of sense of that. And we had to do further sub-classifications on a lot of these areas. But what you can quite clearly see there is the differentiation between the coastal regions, where the majority are non-peatland. There's a lot of fields, a lot of agriculture around Mid-Yale here. And what you're seeing is, and then you're actually starting to see, but you see the road coming through there, but it is a bit messy. So we have to do further classification on that. And then that takes us down to if we get rid of that, we then get to something that resembles what we're looking at now. Now, if you look at that, again, we've now differentiated what is basically the grasslands, the intensive grasslands, the extensive grasslands. We've got the lochs are showing up really quite nicely here. And again, this is still, to kind of maybe explain it, it's a slightly complex way to explain it, but what we're looking at here is what's called a raster. image. So this is actually a bit like a photograph. It's classified, so the pixels all have a set color. So we can actually look at the, if we look down here, so we've got the various unclassified water, pasture, peatland, non-peatland vegetation, wetland. Again, these were working classes before we actually took everything into the final report. So yeah, what we're looking, this is a sort of what we start with that, and then we get to that, which is looking a lot neater. And then what we do is we take all these, then I think there's one more to show you here. That was a different time we did that one. Yeah, that's that shouldn't be there. Sorry about that. So yeah, we take that one. Now we further classified this one. So we brought in the classification for all the urban areas around, like houses, buildings, roads, all the rock areas, things like that. And we also then did some further work on the near natural peat, which is which you can't see so clearly there. There's a lot of it took different types of classification to produce that, purely because of the fact that a lot of the vegetation, even in that area, is similar to the areas which are heavily eroded. So we had to do different classification processes. And then what we do is we take this raster file, which is just basically pixel based, and we turn it into a vector file. And what we do is we basically look at all the different colors on there. So there's how we got, we've got there's 12 different, 11 including black, 12 including black. We take all these colors, we use a thing called a raster calculator, and we produce a new raster which is just containing that one particular pixel value. So it could be the brown or the dark green or the light green or whatever. We know what that value is. So we create a new raster file of that, and then we run a few processes. We sieve it, which basically gets rid of all the tiny little dots that are scattered around, which we saw in the very first one we looked at. Lots and lots of little dots and things like that. So it's a process called sieving, which basically allows the small particles to fall out, and we're just left with the bigger particles. And then we vectorize it. So we turn that into basically polygons, which are basically shapes. Now you can change the size of them. You can make them big or small. If I zoom in on this, you'll see it very quickly pixelates. That's because each of these has a discrete value. So that green has a discrete value. These pixels have a discrete value. So when we change that into a vector, and you'll see that here, if we go to the vector classes, and what I can do is get rid of that. And now we're looking at the vector classes, and if you see I zoom in on the same area in the vector classes, because they're actually based on the, but I can make them as big as possible, and they're these. If I go to the single classes, actually, that's going to be better, I think. So uncheck that. Uncheck that. There we go. I should have done this before. Sorry about that. And I'll uncheck some of these and just bring it all in one by one, let you see how it works. So what we've done is we've taken the rasters. Locks is a good one to start with. Like, so we've created all the locks from the areas that had water in them. And then we look at the extensive grassland. So that's the extensive grassland that lies inside the peat boundary. I think I discussed the peat boundary, why we needed that earlier on. There's the peat boundary there. I can get rid of the yellow coastline, and you can see the area that we've got the peat boundary. Then we've got the heather dominated modified bog, which is by far the largest class of yell, and I think in most of the peatland areas, it's this modified bog is the pretty much everywhere, and then we can look at the there's this grass-dominated modified bog. There's not so much of that, but it's there, and then we look at the eroded modified bog, and this takes up a large, huge percentage of this. This is actively eroding, so this is the stuff that's really spitting out the carbon. And when we're doing the peatland code classification, we take these areas and then we buffer them as well. So we add a 30-meter buffer around them, which makes them even bigger. But it kind of gives you a reasonably accurate representation of the actively eroding. And then we've got the near natural bog up here. What we have to do when we're doing this, then we as the areas that we've classified into near natural bog, then we have to look at the areas underlying it, and we have to use a sort of difference calculation. So we basically remove so we don't have overlapping. It's important to get our calculations right. We have to ensure that there's no overlapping areas. So if you've got your modified bog, your near natural bog, if you have a look at I've clipped that, so you're still seeing areas of the modified bog underneath it, but there's the near natural bog. So this, when we do the calculations, we're not got some overlapping areas. And then we have I mean, that's basically the whole lot we can combine into one second. And this is the one that you're kind of pretty much everybody's familiar with on that, because it's on the front cover of the report. And we did the additional classification around here, showing the areas of industrial and urban residential. I mean, we're even picking up, just isolated houses, pretty much all around you see the houses, these little red areas here. So it's incredible the granularity we got through the classification. And the great thing is, it's repeatable, because we have the training areas, we have the spectral signatures. So we have to normalize the imagery, but we can use the same training data if we want to do this again, say in the next 5-10 years or whatever. So so that's how that's how it was done. Sorry, I've spent a bit longer on that than I intended to, but I just think it's better to have a bit of background and of how it actually works. And that was a huge amount of work. I'll make no bones about it. There was, we're talking about, about 30 working days to produce that. But a lot of that work doesn't have to be repeated. A lot of that work is done now. So, oh, sorry about that. It's just telling me that it's not getting. I can get rid of that. Sorry about that. We'll close that. So that's how we classified it. I'll get questions at the end. I'll just keep cracking on. Now work out how to stop sharing. I'm completely new to this. Somebody help me out how to stop sharing.
There was a button at the top of my screen, like a red button that said stop sharing.
Mine's a green one at the bottom.
Green one at the bottom. Oh yeah, no, annotate. Oh dear, I can't see how to stop sharing this. No, I don't want to close it. Sorry about this. I cannot see how to stop sharing this.
In the
Rory,
top
try
right-hand,
when I hover over the share button, it also comes up with an Alt command, Alt+S.
Nope, not doing anything.
Okay.
Is it
Ah,
from,
right, currently sharing. Getting there, I think. Ah, stop sharing. There we go. Got it. It was in the taskbar away at the top. I've never seen that before. Apologies for that. Anyway, I'm going to share again. And we'll be sharing this one here. So this is the hang on, I'll go back to the top. Yeah, so this is the report which I assume everybody's seen. This was the version 1.1 that was released on the 30th of June. I won't really go into huge amounts of detail. Basically, it was we added an amendment record, corrected some version numbering, and we added additional information about the soil types, and there's some formatting corrections and stuff like that. I won't go into the background. What I will do is just go straight to the executive summary. So basically, we divided it up. So the total area of Yell is 213.94 kilometres square. That's the area inside that red boundary I showed you on the previous, the coastline of Yell, not the peatland boundary. And the sort of big figures, I won't go into them all in absolute detail, but if we look at the highlights, total area of all land classes was 213.94 square kilometres. The total area of peatland, including grasslands, and this is inside that that peatland boundary I told you, that with this arbitrary boundary that we had to create to differentiate between the different what could be attributed to peatland and what isn't, comes to 174.85 kilometres square. So the total emissions attributable to the peatlands are 67.595 kilotons, and as Ash says, that is a colossal amount. Okay, now that's taking into account what the actual you know, the near natural peatland there that's actually possibly actively sequestering peat, although it's debatable whether it is or not, because it's surrounded by areas that aren't. And then if we look at all land classes, so not just the peatland classes, but all the grasslands, all the agricultural land, all the industrial land, which isn't a huge amount, that zooms up to almost double to 116.396 kilotons. Now, we can't change what's happening in agriculture. It's just one of these things we can't change. But what we can change is the peatlands, and so that's you know, that's a 67.595 thousand tons. You know, 67,595. It's a lot of tons of carbon. That's something that we can address. And this other one, which was a kind of debated figure, but according to this report, 81.7% of Yell is made up of peatland, which is it's a huge amount. It's most of the island. So these are the actual classes that we used. I'm not going to bore you going into all the detail of the report, because it's slightly different to the classes used in the Peatland Code. This is there was another report done by a company called Aether in 2022-23, I think, and they were looking at more at the other types like waste, energy usage, all that kind of thing. They looked arbitrarily at peatland. But one of the things it said in the report was that further work needs to be done in this area. So we use the IPCC classification, but we also used I think Sue pointed out that we had used the emission factors we'd used had been updated. We actually used the emission factors that were used in the original report, so there could be a direct correlation between the two reports. I think what I could do is actually release another version of this with the updated emission factors. Whether that will make a massive difference, I don't know. I think I maybe did have a look at it before, but I don't think it makes a huge amount of difference, but it may do. And basically there we have the map, which has got the legend on it. I made available to Community Energy Scotland, and I think it can be made available to other people if they want it. The original imagery, the original files, which can be downloaded. The report is available on our SharePoint site, and I think there is some other stuff that's there that should be available as well. So if you want the link to that, just drop me an email and I can send you that. But that's the granularity we got. I mean, there is other land cover types that we didn't work at, but I think we picked up the bulk of them. And then we looked at the actual peatland classes. So we had heather-dominated modified bog, which is drained, near natural bog, grass-dominated modified bog, which is drained, and grass-dominated modified bog, which is undrained, intensive and extensive grasslands, and eroding modified bogs. So that's basically the categories we used for peatland. And that's basically ignoring all the stuff that's outside that. You notice you've got no like buildings or industrial or roads or anything in there at all. I've mentioned about about how we actually had to find the differentiation between the extensive and intensive grassland on the coastline. So the map looks slightly different when you take away all the agriculture, and we're just looking at the areas which are attributed to peatland, and this is the bit that's obviously of interest to us here. And then you basically got the different classes relating just to the peatland only. And then we look at classes outside the peatland, and this is predominantly around the coastline. You're seeing all the extensive and intensive grasslands, your commercial, marine and industrial, and your urban and buildings. So there is some misclassification, there always is. So we have a look in the middle there that is showing that there's a building on the road between, there's a bit of road that runs along there. The old road runs along the side of the new road there. It classified that as a building. We should have corrected that. I've just noticed that just now. We also did some drone surveys while we were there. We did 3 kind of representative areas. We did an area just north of Mid-Yell. We did an area just south of Mid-Yell, and we did an area up at Dulciter. The Dulciter one was looking at, there was a lot of near natural stuff up there, and the first area we did north of Mid-Yell, sorry, was a kind of nice representative area. It lay in a valley, so you had some sort of grasslands, things like that, but it was very much within the peatlands. And then the area south of Mid-Yell is quite a heavily eroded area. So we did drone surveys on them, and we were sort of ground truthing them against the satellite classification work we did. It's not very easy to see on here, but what I've done here is overlaid the satellite classification against the drone imagery. Somebody say something there? And looking at the things, and it actually works in very nicely with what we were seeing when we did some work on the. I think no, I don't have that here, unfortunately. We did some. I think I can. I'm sharing another screen. We did some geomorphology and some classification on the drone data, and it overlays incredibly. Obviously, the drone resolution, we're looking at 10 centimeters per pixel, and the satellite resolution, we're looking at 10 meters per pixel. So, you know, there's a huge variance there in terms of resolution, but over a broader scale, it is showing up. The ground truthing with the drone footage actually worked quite well. We're seeing it here. You can actually see these areas where I don't know how well you can see that or not, but you can see there's definitely some areas of actively eroding peatland here, and these dark red color is the actively eroding, so it's picking up, the classifier's picking that up quite nicely. And again, we've got some grasslands around here, around the side of the road, which is picking up quite nicely. So the classification was remarkably good. We were really quite impressed. If we could get much higher resolution, Another option to do this would be to use a fixed wing aircraft. It's not as expensive as it sounds like. So to basically fly the whole Yell, and we could realistically have a 7 to maybe a 20 centimeter resolution, which would be able to give us far more accurate data than we can get from a satellite. But huge amount of work processing it. 217 square kilometers would take about a week of our really high powered workstation to actually process it alone before we did any GIS on it. So but we did ground truth it. We did actually drive around as well. We looked at areas basically with this map and areas that were accessible. We went and had a look and said, does that correlate that? And yeah, 9 times out of 10 we were bang on the money. So that is quite reassuring in terms of that. And there's a kind of couple of images there showing this quite nice contrast here with this actively eroding modified bog there, and then just to the right of that image we're looking at near natural bog there, which is quite different. And then this is a nice near natural bog. It's rich in cotton grass and sphagnum moss there. This one's got a bit of a hole in it, but again, you can see the sphagnum really clearly there. It all came down to the carbon audit. I've given you the kind of classes that we actually used. So we look at the peatland classes. There's basically the 5 peatland classes: heather dominated, grass dominated, eroding, modified, and near natural. And we do have a deficit, a sequestration figure there, so that's minus 0.23 kilotons. But can actually see the biggest one here is the 23.714 for the heather dominated modified bogs. So that's basically when you look at the peat hill and you see the heather, that's the bulk of peatland in Yell is this modified bog. And then you see the eroding modified bog. Because it's got a much higher emission factor, it's 4.79 as opposed to 3.37. But it's the actual heather dominated and the grass dominated modified bogs make up a bigger carbon emission than the eroding modified bog alone. So the eroding modified bog is the stuff you see. It looks really bad, and it's emitting more carbon. But the whole system itself is emitting carbon. And obviously the eroding areas are going to get bigger and bigger unless something is done to prevent them. And the bigger they get, you're jumping from emission factor of 3.37 to 4.79. So it's a big jump. And there's just sort of nice little pictures there that kind of show you it. So it's very clear if we look at the peatland classes, the top pie chart there. So by far the biggest is the heather dominated modified bog, grass dominated modified bog, the next one. Then you can break down much smaller areas. The eroding modified bog is the next biggest. Then we have the undrained, drained, and near natural bog, which is and there is a tiny little bit of intensive grassland within the peatland areas, but it's not. It could be pretty much discounted. And this is all classes. This is looking at the comparing. If you look at this one, all classes by emissions. Now you see all classes by area. Right, the heather dominated modified bog is the largest by area, but by emissions, it's actually accounts for less than a quarter of the entire emissions. If you look at the extensive grassland, now I've just noticed this one's actually been. I've just noticed this is an error in the title of that. That should be extensive grassland, but it's not. I'll get that changed. Or the colour's wrong. But you can see extensive grassland is by far the largest emitter of carbon. And there's really nothing much you can do about that, short of changing agricultural practices. We also did NDVI, which is the normalized difference vegetation index. Now we used this. This will be the last, basically last. I'll talk on the report. but we use this as a further aid to classification. NDVI basically takes, it's just basically a sum. If you have a look at it here, for the formula is, so we take remember I said we looked at the different multispectral channels. So we take the value of the near infrared and we subtract red from it. And then we divide that by the value of near infrared plus red. So basically all the pixels in the near infrared minus red and all the pixels in the near infrared plus red, we divide them, and that gives us this normalized difference vegetation index. Now it's an index. It runs from -1 to +1. There's another one we can do, which is the NDWI, which is the normalized difference water index, which shows how much water is actually in the vegetation. So we see the value here. Actually, we went to 0.2 as there was I don't think there's very much below, but basically anything below 0, 0 and below is not vegetation. So if it's 0 and below, it's either water or it's concrete, it's rock, it's buildings, it's whatever, it's roads. It's not vegetation. Anything tends to be above 0.1 is vegetation. The NDVI is a kind of can be used as an indication of plant health on a kind of much larger scale, but it can also be used to help to assist in classifying. And you're probably not going to see it very clearly up here, but if you look up here in the dulcimer area, we're seeing there's the slight variances in the colors that you're seeing in this, like looking further down, which is areas which we know are modified bog. But up here, the spectral signatures were quite different. The NDVI was quite different, running right to the coast up here, which correlates quite nicely with the neo-natural peat that's up there. And so we use the NDVI values to help us classify the near-natural bog. And again, we could probably work further with these indexes. The water index was quite interesting as well, because it basically shows you the water content. This is actually showing you the water content of the vegetation. So looking around the coast, you can see there's a much higher water. The darker the colors, the higher the water content. We're seeing a lot of, the agricultural land. And as you get onto this, the sort of lighter blue here, it's the sort of dry heathers. We're looking up here again, looking at this nice healthy peat. You're actually seeing a lot darker colors. You're seeing some more water content in the vegetation itself. Sphagnum moss is basically a sponge. So we use that again to help us classify these areas. And this is what you look at it if you do the drone imagery, and we do multispectral, and we do the NDVI on that, and the water indexes. The detail you get is far greater than the detail we can get from the satellite imagery, because the satellite imagery is basically 20 centimeters a pixel for the near infrared stuff, whereas we're getting 5 centimeters per pixel resolution here, so a huge difference.
Just aware it's nearly 8, Rory. So
yeah, I'm going to stop there. I shall work out how to stop sharing again. There we go.
No, it's super interesting.
Right, I could go on actually, but I've covered how we did it and covered the report, so I hope it's been of interest to you, and how we went about it.
Yeah, massively interesting. And I wonder if people have got questions.
Everyone's wanting to go home.
No, I've got a very quick one, Rory, if people have got time. In terms of the developmental work and developing algorithms and the classification, can that learning be applied elsewhere in terms of developing a protocol? Would it make it easier to do the same type of survey in another location, or would it have to be bespoke?
No, it's in terms of, I mean, not so much the satellite stuff, but the other stuff we're doing, where we're using geomorphology algorithms to do hags and gullies, that kind of thing. That can be applied across the board. That would work anywhere. So, and again, it's something we'd be looking at. Time is one of the things I don't have, but I would love to have the time to sit down and maybe write some kind of protocol that could be adopted and used. Because it is, I mean, we do have some of our own scripting, our own Python scripts and things like that, but be happy to make them available. And I mean, in terms of I mean, my company is doing this commercially, so we charge the Amenity Trust to do the surveys. Obviously, we haven't up to now really been charging for doing the analysis, and but we are charging Viking SSER for doing the analysis. But the analysis can be, anybody with GIS proficiency can do it. So yeah, and happy to share it. As Ash said, some kind of, sort of, partnership kind of thing would be absolutely brilliant. And also, I mean, I've spoken, to some of the commercial guys like George Hepburn Scott, things like that, who are working with Forest Carbon, and they're once you get into that commercial side of things, it's not quite so easy to share, but on a sort of more open scale, it is easy to share, and I would love to make this available. Yes.
No, thanks.
Yep.
Hopefully we'll be getting and giving you a call sometime next
No
year.
worries. Yeah, do that. Drop me an email or give me a call. Yeah. Feel free.
Thanks, sir.
Any more?
Yeah, Adrian has a few.
Well, I'll make it quick. So I'm interested in blanket bog emission cycles and the methodology that you're using to understand those cycles. So, I mean, one question is, are peat bog emissions and absorption cycles annual or cyclical in a different way? And how are you going to go about establishing that? Or what have you done rather in terms of
One of the things we're doing, and we're doing it on one of the restoration sites on the Viking site, is we're looking at bog breathing. We're looking at what we're doing is we're putting in posts into the ground as far down into the peat as we can get them, and measuring them very accurately with GNSS, and then they're used as control points in the when we do the drone survey, and then we'll go back in March, April next year, do the same again, and we'll be able to get an idea of the of how the movement in the actual the vertical movement in the bog. It's also possibly an element of lateral movement as well. So having that data will give us a better idea how the cycle actually works, and we'll be doing this twice a year for the next for the life of the Viking project anyway. So that's going to be a good source of data. Yeah. So.
And the other question is there any data on how peat bogs respond to extreme weather events? So let's say, for example, you get a particularly hot summer or a particularly wet or cold winter. Is there any sort of historical data on that?
I think Ash would be the best person to answer that one. I'm not, again, it's something I just don't think it's been looked at regularly enough now with the advent of peatland restoration sites and being actively monitored. Then yes, they will see what will happen after, say, really, like, we've had some once in a decade rain events up here, a lot of landslips, things like that. That has affected, that's bound to have affected the water course, water table, things like that. Thing is, Shetland's so hilly, everything tends to recover incredibly quickly. The water will run through the water table when we raise for a little bit, then it just runs through and runs out, and everything is back to normal within a few days. So I just don't think there's enough data there yet to be able to to answer that question.
Yeah, because that was going to feed in my final question, which is, for how long is it required that emissions are measured against average climatic variation? Because only then will you really understand how all of this can create something that's carbon neutral.
Yes, exactly. And I just don't think the data's there yet. No. So.
Okay, I'll stop that because I've got a few more.
Well, we have one more minute if you even want to ask one more.
Fine. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's still a very emerging science, like you say, Rory. There's a lot to be learned, and monitoring has only just really started on a lot of these sites. So hopefully we'll have answers to some of those questions at some point. But I just wanted to say thanks for all the work you did, because, oh my God, that's a phenomenal amount of effort I can see that you've done, and such a interesting map that you've been able to develop. for us. So yeah, thank you.
The maps are nice and they're pretty pictures, but you know, the actual numbers underneath them.
Yeah, the numbers
they're
will certainly
brilliant.
hopefully drive
I love the numbers.
some of my restoration projects. That would be good.
I've got one last very quick question, if that's okay. Because the other bit that's sort of missing, you've been using satellite and drone data. I'm looking at the spectral side, but presumably coming back to that earlier question, we could introduce flux tower data into the mix to try and improve the accuracy rather than using sort of national standard emission factors which might vary at a local level, and it might also allow us to look at seasonality and annual variation.
Yeah, I mean, there's the flux tower at Girlster that the James Hutton, but I actually look after it for them. So now it's been up there for, oh God, it must be 2 or 3 years now. So that must be gathering good data, that one. So it's incredible it's survived as well, because it's there's been some pretty extreme weather. So, and I think SSE putting pylons right beside it probably disturbed the data a little bit, but it stinks of creosote when you go up there now. I don't know how that's going to affect the CH sensor.
But my thanks, that was absolutely brilliant. Well done.
Yeah, thank you, Ewan. Yeah, I mean, I could ramble on all night. I was going to have a nice flashy PowerPoint prepared, but I didn't. And I just thought I'd use the raw data and let you see how we produced it. And so I hope it's been informative and an interesting deal. And thanks for having me.
Thanks, yeah, to all of you. I'll let Hannah do the final thanks, but yeah, really interesting from both you and Ash.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you all very much for coming up, giving up your time, and it was very informative and also interactive as well. Everybody's thoughts and questions were all very valid, and it's great to have a discussion too. So thank you. Anna, this will be available on a recording as well.
Yeah, it will be.
Yeah. And if anybody wants that, how can they get that then?
We'll upload it onto the CES website, but I can send an email to any participants as
Okay.
well, if that would be helpful.
That is magic. Thank you. Cheers, Anna. Thanks, folks. All the best now.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Cheers all. Take care. Bye now.
Bye.
Gonna enjoy some time off the screen. Thanks again.
Cheers. Take care.
Bye now.